Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. Since summer of last year I have been making my way through Double Dragon history, taking a retrospective look at every single entry in the iconic series. The franchise that established the cooperative beat-em-up genre itself has had a roller coaster of an existence, resulting in extreme highs and lows, giving us both brilliant and awful games in equal measures. This means that Double Dragon is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Recently, Double Dragon Neon has been released on the Nintendo Switch, a 2012 beat-em-up that originally featured reception that was as inconsistent as the franchise itself. Rather absurdly, while many of the corporate review sites liked the game, there would be other critics who thought the game was simply awful, with the most scathing review coming from IGN, referring to Neon as the very embodiment of what's wrong with HD remakes. At the opposite end of the spectrum, I regularly encounter Double Dragon fans who consider this one of the greatest in the entire series. So what on earth is going on here? Now, considering what a polarising response this game generates, I feel it is the perfect game to explore the history of and look at why such a title received such extreme mixed reception. This may be the most controversial entry in my Double Dragon retrospective series yet. So without further ado, this, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Double Dragon Neon, a game that critics thought was awful. Yeah! The Double Dragon series is vast. Yoshihisa Kishimoto's first two Double Dragons are considered all-time classics that would inspire a generation. But then the development house who owned the franchise would use and abuse the brand's established success, taking advantage of Double Dragon's name value. Game production was outsourced to inexperienced third parties, and in many cases the Double Dragon license was available to be used by anyone who was willing to pay for it. This would result in many terrible games, a bad TV show, and an even worse Hollywood movie, with the only real bright sparks in the series developed inside Technos itself, with Maneki Ebinuma at the development helm, a previous superfan of the franchise who had managed to land a job at Technos. Technos Japan's missteps would result in the company filing for bankruptcy in 1996, but a licensing company named Million Company Limited was formed to purchase some of their intellectual properties, which would include Double Dragon. In 2003, Million would utilise this by developing Double Dragon Advance, a project led by this point respected Maneki Ebinuma, who would produce a game that many argue was the greatest Double Dragon yet. A reimagining of the original game that featured twice as many levels, with many of the coolest features ripped from other Double Dragon games, and implemented into this cult classic too. Double Dragon Advance presented beat-em-up bliss, in an era when games from such a genre were not that common. Despite the game's extreme high quality, one assumes it could never have sold that well, as second-hand copies are a fortune on eBay today. And more importantly, the Double Dragon series would not be visited for another 9 years, when we finally got Double Dragon Neon. In 2005, Million Company Limited would become a subsidiary of Intelligence Limited, but WayForward Technologies would develop the next entry in the famous franchise, a California-based independent developer and publisher. While the company had existed since 1990, mainly producing educational software, fast forward to 2002, the company would develop a game based around their own intellectual property called Shantae, which we all know would receive all sorts of critical acclaim. Many consider it the most technically impressive game that was ever released for the Game Boy Color. Going forward, the company would continue to develop dozens of games for Nintendo handhelds, so by the time we got to Double Dragon Neon in 2012, the company was an established development entity. Now, considering that every other previous American-produced Double Dragon-related piece of media had always been awful, WayForward Technologies would be careful not to make the same mistakes, so would bring in original series creator Yoshihisa Kishimoto himself to the project as a consultant to try and capture the spirit of the classics. Throughout development, he would regularly provide feedback on character design and gameplay elements. With regards to all of this, Kishimoto himself describes Neon as a very Western adaptation of Double Dragon, with certain mechanics taken from previous games, and a mood and feel that reminded him of the original arcade game. Like in the original, with this game players could control martial artists, Billy and Jimmy, as they fight their way through hordes of enemies from the Shadow Warriors gang, trying to rescue Marion. but substantial changes have been made to give this game a fresh, more modern feel. For starters, this was the first Double Dragon game in history that featured 3D graphics rendered with polygon-based models. The game, released on the Xbox 360 and PS3, would also feature a new main villain and leader of the Shadow Warriors gang, known as Skullmageddon, who perhaps has more depth and a higher presence than any previous Double Dragon villains. The game, that was released to coincide with the 25th anniversary of the franchise, would feature dialogue and a graphical style that has been heavily inspired by the 1980s. So while the game was new, it presented many elements that attempted to make gamers feel nostalgic about a certain era. This is emphasised even further with the soundtrack for the game, pairing remixes of classic Double Dragon tunes with a mix of 80s pop music sounding anthems. The music in the game, composed by Jake Kaufman, does a good job of adding to the overall feel of the game. At its heart, the game plays like a standard arcade beat-em-up, featuring designated punch, kick, jump and run buttons. To build on a play, an evade button has been added for dodging attacks. Speaking of dodging, if timed correctly by players, they will glow red, which, fitting with the game's 80s theme, is known as gleaming, which allows players to perform more powerful moves. Like in other beat-em-ups, items can be picked up off the floor to replenish health, but also money can be used in the game to buy items from shops, and special mixtapes can be found too, which can be equipped to give players extra abilities that, when utilised, consume an extra energy meter. These tapes' powers can even be improved by visiting a tapesmith and paying him with mithril, which is obtained from defeating bosses. Finally, in terms of completely new features, Billy and Jimmy can perform a special high-five technique, which has a number of functions, including allowing two communist players to split their life meters and share them an equal amount, psych up their teammates, or instantly trigger Gleam. In terms of more cooperative functionality, players have a limited time to revive a partner who has been KO'd before a life is deducted. Also, when one player has run out of lives, they can steal more from the other player, if said other player still has 2 or more left. When experiencing Double Dragon Neon, players will instantly be greeted by nostalgic familiarity, with a remix of the classic Double Dragon arcade game's Attract theme. The opening stage also treads familiar ground, presenting Marion being punched in the gut by a member of the Shadow Warriors gang, as the boys give chase in hot pursuit once more. On this first stage, we hear the return of the classic first stage theme from the original 2, as the game presents basic instructions to play as the players brawl through neon streets. Various enemies are encountered, including many a dominatrix to punch in the face. As to be fair, a game is not really a beat-em-up unless it lets you do this regularly. Now, to give some of my thoughts on the look of this game, my thoughts are kind of mixed. Whilst the music does a good job of making this feel like Double Dragon, the combat is intuitive enough, but I am kind of split on the game's graphics themselves. All the sprites in the game have a bit of a PS2 look to them, and this game was made in 2012. I like the character designs themselves, but I think the whole game would have looked better and more polished presented in 2D, much like Streets of Rage 4. Speaking of 2D, all the backgrounds are drawn in 2D and look fantastic. So I think it could have all looked even better if it stuck to such a theme throughout. The 3D parts of the game give it a bit of a mobile vibe, which is a shame as the game is so much more than that. Regarding the presentation, the entire game features an over-the-top 80s aesthetic. Basically, the whole vibe is very cartoony and has elements that are made to be as cliché 80s as possible, which I guess goes along with the Neon name itself. In a lot of ways, it reminds me of a short film known as Kung Fury, which pokes fun at 80s tropes throughout. It seems that the art and humour placed in this game follows along the same sort of route. It is very self-aware that Double Dragon was in its prime in the 80s, so draws a lot on that in many humorous ways. In terms of characters, classics will resurface, such as lovable villains like the towering Abobo making his welcome return. The fun really starts though when Billy and Jimmy enter a spaceship and meet and face off against the game's main antagonist for the first time, known as Skullmageddon. I absolutely adore this ridiculous character, who now serves as my favourite Double Dragon character in all of history. The villain, that is basically a cross between Skeletor and Shredder from the Turtles, has a never-ending range of bad puns and one-liners. Basically, is everything you would want from a ridiculous slapstick villain, and each appearance he makes in the game brings an extra layer of humour. Hilariously, the third stage sees the character known as Skullmageddon continue to serve some monitors that antagonise the players, but you can just punch the monitors, causing him to panic and freak out that the plasma screens are expensive. He is a great source of entertainment. As the brothers slowly brawl their way through their journey, players will make their way through city streets, ridiculous outer space dojos, and even an Asian countryside. The stages are fun and varied, offering a range of environments to explore. More notable fun unfolds when players make it to the genetic lab, as apart from getting to indulge in more classic beat-em-up action, players come across two boss opponents grinding test tubes. These monsters break through the glass to have the game announce them as mistranslated mutants Bimmy and Jammy. A hilarious Easter egg and reference placed in the game, poking fun at the poor translation found in the NES version of Double Dragon 3. It is moments like this that illustrate the developers' efforts to appeal to the old school fanbase, which is always good stuff. We also get a lift section on this stage, which, as I've pointed out many times, a beat 'em up is not really a beat 'em up without a lift section, so here is one in this game. There are definitely elements of weirdness in this game, not seen since the likes of Double Dragon 3, such as this strange monstrous boss for example, or this section where you use its remains to slide down this slope. In some ways, while the game has many callbacks to the classics, in many places it still tries to do its own thing. There's even a graveyard stage where you take on zombies and all sorts of other ghoulies. The game is not just a simple retelling of old. Nearing the end of the game, Skullmageddon's palace looks great, and just how you would imagine a Shadow Warriors gang leader's lair would look, presented with a more modern art style. We also have some stylistic, nice looking sections where you fight with just silhouettes, which I must say look pretty cool. The lair, like in games of old, is laced with all sorts of traps designed to take the players out, which is another nice callback. The final encounter with Skullmageddon is an amusing one, partially down to introducing the new and improved Marion, who Skullmageddon proudly refers to as Evil Marion before the big 2-on-2 fight begins. This fight is a long, tough one, but after this battle against these foes, Skullmageddon escapes to another realm in time and space, and Evil Marion is restored back to her original form. Marion then uses the power of love to help the brothers reach Skullmageddon, but not in their human forms. Once Skullmageddon is found, he reveals that all he wanted from all of this nonsense was a simple date, leading to one last match against this foe with the classic Double Dragon theme blaring through the speakers throughout. After another long fight, the final blow is hit on Mr. Mageddon, as one of the brothers punches him off the edge of a cliff, resulting in him falling through space as the end credits slowly roll, leading to one final great moment from this amazing villain, with him singing about his loss, accompanied with a karaoke sing-along bar at the bottom of the screen. Skullmageddon is truly epic, and I cannot recall being entertained by any in-game villain quite as much as this one. He really makes the Neon experience more memorable. From his appearance in the game's ridiculous continue screen to his farewell song, everything about this slapstick loony is amazing. At Double Dragon Neon's first release in 2012, as mentioned, it would receive mixed reviews, so let's look at some of the praise and criticism from big publications at the time. Metro thought the game was absolutely amazing, in short stating that the game was
as gaudy and over the top as the 80s itself, but not quite as shallow. The masterful reboot of the granddaddy of scrolling beat-em-ups has real punch. It has just enough depth to keep the game interesting, while still maintaining the same great co-op action as the original. Interesting power-ups, fantastic soundtrack, and a great sense of humour.
GameWatcher.com would heap an even higher level of praise on this title when they summarised that
Double Dragon Neon is evidence. Evidence that my misplaced obsession with a classic coin-op wasn't misplaced after all. It's proof for those who weren't there, or weren't even born, who believe themselves gaming experts because they remember when the first Deus Ex game came out, or Deus Ex for those who were, It's a return to gaming ancestry that confirms the retro gamer's assertion that it actually was better back then. And finally, gaming is good once again.
So, as you can see, some critics were beyond impressed with Double Dragon for bringing something old school to the table with a self-awareness that it was good fun that was celebrating the past, which is further backed up by the game's sense of humour. But now let's look at the opposite end of the spectrum and see why some corporate website workers absolutely detested the game. Spazio Games was right.
If you love the scrolling fighting game genre, you grew up with Jimmy and Billy, and you want the wonderful memory of those wonderful years to remain indelible in your mind, remembering the Double Dragon brand for the emotions it's transmitted to you, then stay away from this game. The arcades were once the temple of culture for every child, a magical place in which to spend hours and hours. Neon has very little to do with the original, both in terms of atmosphere and gameplay. Even the bosses are not exceptional, neither the charisma or concept, nor for how they present themselves in the context of the title. The spirit of the Double Dragon in this episode is now only a distant memory.
As highlighted at the beginning of the video, the most scathing opinion regarding Neon would come from one of the largest and most powerful gaming news sites online, IGN, who would give the game just 3.5 out of 10, with writer Mitch Dyer not just attacking Double Dragon Neon, but in a bizarre motion attacking every beat 'em up game that had ever been made in history. He starts out by writing,
"Remember when arcade beat 'em ups were deliberately too difficult so you'd pay to keep playing? How about when failure meant having to replay an entire level? It's a good thing those days are over, and it's too bad Double Dragon Neon doesn't realize it. Double Dragon Neon is the embodiment of what's wrong with HD remakes. It's afraid to let go of the 80s altar it worships at, even if it means cramming a crummy, archaic experience down players' throats. Neon never sets out to be anything other than Double Dragon. There's a laundry list of issues in Double Dragon that don't sit well decades later, and Neon retains all of them. Let's address a sad truth nobody wants to hear. The brawler genre is not very good anymore. The beat 'em up was built on the back of arcade game design. Difficulty didn't come by design, but by mechanics meant to scam kids. Double Dragon exploited our love of games, so we'd keep paying for it. Double Dragon Neon functions in a similar way. It's a brawler that's too focused on amusing you with 80s flair, and it comes at the expense of worthwhile gameplay.
So to reflect on both of these very negative reviews from critics, the first one from Italy's greatest criticisms of the game is that the presentation is not faithful enough to Double Dragon of old, and instead chooses to make a mockery of the 80s, which are fair comments to be fair, as personally I agree with what they said there. I view such characters in a positive light though, because as revolutionary as the gameplay was in the original, the game did not have as much story or character development involved. So I thought the whole over-the-top 80s cheesy slapstick comedy mixed with the formula of old was a refreshing change of pace, especially when you consider Double Dragon has never had much of a solo brand identity to it to begin with, due to Technos licensing their property out to so many different entities. So I do not feel Neon is as unfaithful as Spazio Games claims. Now though, let's get to the truly interesting review that was made for this game, the insanely negative hit piece released by IGN, one of the largest gaming news sites online. The website had nothing positive to say about the game whatsoever, and the journalist would condemn not just the game but the entire genre it came from, criticising Neon for ludicrous things, for example moaning that if you die you have to start a level again. What I find most distasteful about the whole article is that he poses his opinions as facts, with phrases written in it like, "Let's address a sad truth nobody wants to hear, the brawler genre is not very good," which now, over 7 years removed from when he wrote the article, still does not make any sense, as Streets of Rage 4 has proved to be one of the most popular games of 2020, and would follow a traditional beat-em-up formula. So the opinions he poses as facts are beyond insane. Apart from an innate hatred the journalist holds for arcade beat-em-ups, what strikes me as most odd of all is that somehow he seems to believe that unless you are old enough to remember the 80s, then the environment the game offers will be completely lost on gamers. I am really not sure why anyone would feel that unless you lived through a period, you would not understand stereotypical tropes. For example, I was born in the 80s, but that does not mean I do not associate hippies, drugs and psychedelics with the 60s, and flares and disco with the 70s. I am pretty confident that few young people are stupid enough to not understand that neon lights and the music in the game are associated with the 80s. He seems to be massively underestimating young people's intelligence. As a school teacher myself, I can tell you when I was last teaching a class of 10-year-olds in 2018, they all knew what a Game Boy was, and despite the certification were all addicted to watching the Netflix show Stranger Things, where the plot is set in 1984. I am 100% confident that each of those children would be able to identify when Double Dragon Neon is supposed to be set, and recognise the tropes the game brings to the table. It makes me wonder if the reviewer even knew any real life humans. To see practically no good in Double Dragon Neon whatsoever astounds me, as the game not only brings classic beat 'em up action to the table, but pairs it with a self-aware take of the 80s, and includes one of the most entertaining villains I have ever seen in the video game period. It shines in so many departments. While, like with most games, there are clearly some flaws there, I struggle to see how anyone could honestly view this game as complete garbage. And personally, I think this review from IGN is one of the worst takes I have ever read online regarding any video game ever. Obviously, the best way to form an opinion on a game is by playing it yourself, and if you want a good idea on the quality of a product, it is good to read as many different review sources as possible. Hence why I like to talk about a range of takes in my videos, as it means you get a good perspective by taking them all into account. It blows my mind that big websites like IGN and other corporate companies only have one journalist write about each title, presenting just one definitive opinion on each game's quality. Would it not make these websites more fair and balanced to have at least about 5 reviews on each game? It would prevent them from being a laughing stock on occasion like now. This certainly isn't the first time I have read a review from one of their critics who appears to hate the entire genre that a game is from that they are covering. It's madness! I do not like Coronation Street or EastEnders for example, but you don't see me trying to make a living from writing and talking about soap operas online. I just do not understand the mentality of hiring someone to review a game from a genre that they have no appreciation or even respect for. This is all beyond insanity to me. Luckily for you, you have Big Daddy Top Hat here, and I try my best to make sense of all of this nonsense. But if you happen to be someone on the rather casual side of gaming and get all of your gaming news from IGN, you're not going to likely want to play Double Dragon Neon, which is a crying shame as it's a very novel game that deserves recognition for its quality. Neon is a great take on the classic franchise, perhaps one of the best ever, and it's a shame that these sort of idiots do not recognise that. So ladies and gentlemen, that was the mad story of Double Dragon Neon and why some uneducated journalists hate it. If you want to learn more about Double Dragon, I will attach my Double Dragon playlist to my end card and as a pinned comment, so feel free to watch my many videos covering said subject. If you are really hardcore and want to help me out in making these crazy videos, consider checking out my tiers and becoming a backer on Patreon. There is a whole library of exclusive videos for you to unlock over there, with the newest edition providing coverage of Russia's awful handheld. So why not go over there and join my wonderful Patreon community. Speaking of patrons, thank yous go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, A Murder of Crows, Heyo Paulo Lopez, Joseph Rasmick, Ben Harradine, Corey R. Marsh Sr., Capcom vs SNK, BXL Gotham, Rowan Dinched, Evan Border, Philip Mampf, Cambo Rambo 82, Azra Rorakai, Keith Ferguson, Dropkin Varela, Prince Knight, Michael Cullix, Ago, Jordan Durant, Angel Light 85, Alethea Swanson, Nick Daniels, Princess Sana, Glennie Glenn, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor Kid Anime, Justin Wang, Aaron McNamara, Hermes Gonzalez, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Michael Hall, Wesley Sanghi, Ben Dover, Langston Miller, New, Brian Barry, Sarah Powell, Vladimir Renee, Marvin Aaron Liga, Chris Cool, TOG Driver, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Richard Stu Stewart, James McDonald, Dan Van Dammit, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bow, Chris Fisk, Mike Bruno, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Retroverse.com, Casey Wright, Synth Spaces, Zai, Andrew Bazansky, Gunther Hendricks, and everybody else who continues to back this channel. Thank you very much. Yeah, cheerio.